Ukraine caught Russia's $250 million bomber refueling at night, then turned it into a mid-air destruction.
On the night of September 14, 2025, somewhere over Russian airspace, a $250 million strategic bomber was doing something it thought was completely safe, refueling in the darkness. The crew had no idea they were being watched. What happened in the next 90 minutes would become one of the most embarrassing moments for the Russian Air Force in this entire war. This is the story of how Ukraine pulled off what many thought was impossible, tracking, hunting, and destroying one of Russia's most valuable military assets while it was at its most vulnerable. And the way they did it, that's what makes this story absolutely insane. September 14th started like any other night for the Russian bomber crew. They were flying a Tupolev Tu-22M3, a massive supersonic bomber that Russia has been using to terrorize Ukrainian cities since day one of this war. This particular aircraft, worth over $250 million, it can carry 24 tons of bombs and cruise missiles. And on this night, it was on a long-range mission, probably preparing to launch cruise missiles at Ukrainian infrastructure. But there's a problem with long missions. You run out of fuel, and when you're a massive strategic bomber, you need a lot of it. So the plan was simple: meet up with a tanker aircraft in the middle of the night, refuel, and continue the mission. Standard procedure. They'd done it hundreds of times before. Except this time, someone was watching. Ukrainian intelligence had been tracking Russian bomber patterns for months. They knew the flight paths, they knew the refueling windows, and they knew that when a bomber is connected to a tanker, it's basically a sitting duck. Both aircraft flying slow, straight, and predictable, unable to maneuver, completely exposed. The Ukrainians had been waiting for this moment. Now here's where it gets interesting. Ukraine doesn't have fighter jets that can reach deep into Russian territory. They don't have long-range interceptor missiles that can hit targets 300 kilometers inside Russia. So how exactly do you hunt a bomber that's refueling in Russian airspace? The answer is something that's changed this entire war: drones. But not just any drones. We're talking about modified long-range Ukrainian-made drones that can fly for hours, navigate precisely, and carry enough explosives to take down a massive aircraft. Let me paint you the picture of what happened next. Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, had operators monitoring Russian air traffic. They use a combination of signals intelligence, radar tracking, and even commercial flight data to build a picture of what's happening in Russian airspace. And on this night, they spotted something valuable. 2 aircraft flying in formation, 1 large bomber signature, 1 tanker signature, flying slow, deep in Russian territory, yes, but not impossible to reach if you plan it right. The order was given: launch the drones. Here's what makes this mission so technically impressive. These drones had to fly over 600 kilometers into Russian territory. They had to navigate without GPS because Russia jams GPS signals. They had to avoid Russian air defenses. And they had to time their arrival perfectly to catch the bomber during the refueling window. Think about that for a second. Ukraine launched drones from their territory, flew them hundreds of kilometers through contested airspace, and timed it so precisely that they arrived exactly when the bomber was most vulnerable. The bomber crew never saw it coming. At approximately 2:30 a.m. local time, the Tu-22M3 was connected to the tanker, taking on thousands of liters of fuel. The pilots were probably relaxed. They were deep in Russian territory. No Ukrainian aircraft could reach them here. What could possibly go wrong? Then the drones arrived. Multiple Ukrainian drones, likely a mix of reconnaissance and attack variants, began their approach. The reconnaissance drones provided real-time video feedback to Ukrainian operators. The attack drones moved in for the kill. Russia's air defense systems, designed to detect and shoot down fast-moving missiles or aircraft, struggled to track these small, slow-moving drones. They flew too low, too slow, too small. By the time Russian radar operators realized what was happening, it was too late. The first drone struck. Explosions lit up the night sky. The bomber, heavy with fuel it had just taken on, was hit directly. Fire erupted from the fuselage. The crew had seconds to react. For a bomber connected to a tanker, there's no quick escape. You can't just break away and dive, you're locked in position. The bomber began to lose altitude. Russian emergency channels lit up with distress calls. The tanker aircraft, now in danger itself, desperately tried to disconnect and escape. But in that chaos, with explosions and fire, coordination breaks down. What happened next was captured by Ukrainian surveillance drones still circling the area. The bomber, now trailing fire and smoke, attempted to make it back to base. But the damage was catastrophic. Control systems failed, the aircraft became unflyable. At approximately 2:47 a.m., the Tu-22M3 crashed in Russian territory. The crew of 4 attempted to eject, but at that altitude and with that much damage, chances of survival were slim. Russian reports later confirmed at least 2 crew members were killed. The aircraft, worth $250 million and years of manufacturing, was completely destroyed. A twisted pile of metal and military secrets scattered across Russian soil. But here's what makes this even more significant: this wasn't a lucky shot. This was precise hunting. Ukraine didn't just get lucky and hit a random target. They tracked, planned, and executed a strike on one of Russia's most valuable aircraft while it was at its most vulnerable moment. Let me break down why this operation was so devastating for Russia, and what it tells us about how this war has evolved. First, let's talk about what Ukraine destroyed. The Tu-22M3 backfire isn't just any aircraft. It's a supersonic strategic bomber that Russia uses for its most important long-range missions. These bombers launch cruise missiles from hundreds of kilometers away, hitting Ukrainian power plants, military bases, and cities. Russia doesn't have many of them. Estimates suggest they only have around 60 operational Tu-22M3s. Losing even one is a significant blow. But the real damage isn't just the aircraft. It's what this operation proved to Russia: nowhere is safe. For 2 years, Russian bomber crews thought they were untouchable when flying deep in Russian airspace. They'd take off from bases hundreds of kilometers from the front line, refuel safely in Russian territory, and launch their attacks without ever getting close to Ukrainian air defenses. It was a comfortable, routine operation. That comfort is now gone. Every Russian bomber crew now knows that Ukraine can reach them, even during refueling operations, even in Russian airspace. That psychological impact is massive. Pilots fly differently when they're scared, they make mistakes, they hesitate, and in aerial warfare, hesitation can be fatal. Second, let's talk about the tactical genius of hitting a refueling operation. When an aircraft is connected to a tanker, it's flying at slow speed, steady altitude, and predictable path. It can't maneuver aggressively. It can't suddenly dive or climb without risking a catastrophic fuel line rupture. It's the aerial equivalent of a sitting duck. Ukrainian planners knew this. They studied Russian refueling patterns, they identified windows of vulnerability, and they waited for the perfect moment to strike. This is asymmetric warfare at its finest. Ukraine doesn't have the capability to fight Russia's air force in direct air-to-air combat, so they don't try. Instead, they find moments of maximum vulnerability and exploit them with precision. Third, the technology behind this strike is fascinating. These aren't your standard commercial drones. Ukraine has developed long-range attack drones that can fly for hours, carry significant explosive payloads, and navigate with remarkable precision even when GPS is jammed. How do they do it? A combination of inertial navigation, terrain mapping, and likely some form of optical targeting in the final approach. These drones follow pre-programmed flight paths, make course corrections based on landmarks and terrain features, and use their onboard cameras to identify and strike targets. Russian air defense systems, built during the Cold War to shoot down fast-moving bombers and missiles, struggle against these slow, small targets. They fly under radar coverage, they blend into ground clutter, and by the time they're detected, they're often too close to stop. This is the future of warfare, and we're watching it unfold in real time over Ukraine. Now let's talk about what Russia lost beyond just the aircraft. That bomber carried classified systems, navigation equipment, communications gear, electronic warfare systems. All of that is now scattered across a crash site where Ukrainian intelligence would love to get access to it, and where Russian military intelligence is desperately trying to secure it. Every piece of wreckage tells a story. Every system can be reverse engineered. Every document recovered is potential intelligence gold. But perhaps the biggest loss for Russia is credibility. For months, Russian military leadership has been telling bomber crews they're safe during refueling operations, that the Ukrainian drones can't reach that far, that Russian air defenses will protect them. One successful strike shattered all of that. Now, Russian bomber crews are flying missions knowing that any time they connect to a tanker, they could be targets. That fear and uncertainty degrades operational effectiveness more than people realize. Pilots who are constantly worried about being shot down make different decisions. They might cut refueling short, which limits their range. They might refuse certain missions entirely. They might demand more fighter escort, which ties up resources. The psychological impact ripples through the entire bomber force. Ukrainian forces celebrated this strike for good reason. They proved they can reach targets that Russia thought were untouchable. They demonstrated that expensive military hardware means nothing if you can't protect it. And they sent a message to every Russian aircrew, "We're watching, and we can reach you anywhere." This operation also highlights something crucial about modern warfare. You don't need the most expensive military to win. You need the smartest tactics, the best intelligence, and the will to innovate. Ukraine has all three. While Russia relies on Soviet-era strategies and equipment, Ukraine is pioneering drone warfare tactics that militaries around the world are now studying. They're proving that small, cheap drones can take down targets worth hundreds of millions of dollars if used cleverly. The implications extend far beyond this single bomber. Every military in the world is now reassessing how they protect high-value aircraft during vulnerable operations like refueling. If Ukraine can do this to Russia, what could a future adversary do to any air force? Air refueling has been a cornerstone of modern air power for decades. It extends range, enables long missions, and gives air forces global reach. But it requires aircraft to fly predictably in known patterns. That predictability is now a vulnerability that can be exploited. So what's the final takeaway from this mission? Ukraine proved that determination, intelligence, and tactical creativity can overcome massive military disadvantages. Russia has more aircraft, more missiles, more money. But Ukraine has better strategy, better innovation, and crews willing to take calculated risks to pull off operations that seem impossible. That $250 million bomber now sits in pieces on Russian soil, a monument to military overconfidence and the changing nature of warfare. And somewhere in Ukraine, drone operators are already planning their next impossible mission. This is how modern war is fought. Not with massive tank battles or traditional air combat, but with intelligence, precision, and the courage to strike when the enemy feels safest. So here's my question for you. What would you do if you were commanding Russian bomber operations right now? How do you protect your aircraft when the enemy can reach anywhere? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you made it this far, hit that like button because this story deserves to be heard. The era of safe skis for Russian bombers is over, and Ukraine just proved it in the most spectacular way possible.